Hi there, and welcome to the podcast Life as a show intently focused on exploring and unearthing the details of professions and the people behind them. I'm your host, Christopher Schoenwald. When you were a kid, do you remember wondering what life would be like in the future? For example, I remember dreaming about what things would be like in the year 2000. Or how about this? Do you recall the wildly famous movie series Back to the Future? When it came out in the 80s, there was a reference to the date 2015 as some far out, near space age we would find ourselves in. Well, my friends, we're there more or less. We are living in the future. My next guest will solidify this fact, his explanation of what he does for a living. David Schmidt is a GIS specialist in Canada, employed as a public servant. What does that mean, and what does he do? Well, here's a quick heads up before Dave more eloquently explains. Basically, GIS stands for Geographic Information Systems. A GIS specialist is someone who is involved in the collection, analysis, and presentation of geographic data or information. And Dave has been doing this for over 20 years and using specialized software to manipulate a client's data to create things like maps, models, and digital dashboards and infographics to help communicate information in more effective ways. Still perplexed? All right, think Google Maps. That takes geographical information and overlays it with additional information like traffic, terrain, commercial businesses, photos, etc., etc. And that is all GIS, and just one example of its application capability. Now, in Dave's role as a GIS specialist, he works every day with real data, creating spatial-based products that help deal with things like the tracking of plant-borne pests, animal diseases, and public safety, just to name a few. Basically, he gathers geospatial data and combines it in fascinating ways to create GIS products, including static maps, web applications, mobile survey applications, models, statistics, and databases that are used to support work done in the public sector. Sound futuristic to you? Well, that's because it is. Whether you knew it or not, our existence is so heavily tied into tech and professionals like Dave that there is literally no going back. On that note, Dave, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Yeah, really excited to get into this with you. Why don't we just get right in here to the first segment, something called Coloring Wikipedia. Okay, and this is a segment in which we try to add some zest to otherwise dry explanations of particular professions. Also, I like to use it to highlight the hidden aspects of the job that are often overlooked or left out. Now, Dave, I lightly explained what it is that you do in your intro, and that info was basically scraped from Wikipedia. I'd be curious if you could add further insight. For example, what would a typical day entail?
Sure. Once again, thanks for having me. I love to talk about GIS, or Geographic Information Systems. So this is a really exciting opportunity for me. Well, a typical day as a GIS specialist, at least in my world, is it's not what everyone might expect. My job is very responsive. So what that basically means is, for the employer that I work for, whatever we're dealing with at that time, be it a project or an emergency, that's what my work will be on that day or that period of time. So in a lot of ways, I can say I don't always know what I'm walking into every day. It makes it kind of exciting and kind of fresh. It's not like that all the time. It's not always super exciting. I do have repetitive tasks that I carry out, or projects that I'm responsible for that work on business cycles and things like that. But for the most part, it'll be the kind of thing where I'm in a response mode. So I'm always learning. I'm always dealing with different things. So that's kind of cool. But another thing I'd like to mention about GIS specifically is over my career, which I guess has been over 20 years now, across 3 or 4 different employers, I've never actually been an expert when I started with that employer on whatever they did. I was an expert in GIS, and really the way I've always looked at it is data is data. So every employer or every company or every agency or wherever you might be working has data, and that data can be applied. GIS can be applied to that data to create the products that we've mentioned already. So in that way, it's also pretty cool because I can learn new things, and I feel like the world's open to me when it comes to employment, because there's always a place for a GIS analyst, even if you don't really think about it off the top. Once you dig deeper, there's always a where in the data, and that where is very important. And as I like to say, GIS is showing you the where. Picture's worth 1,000 words. So you can be looking at databases and spreadsheets all day long and thinking you have the full picture. But a lot of times when you illustrate that picture spatially on a map or a web application, you can see a whole lot of other information, new trends or things like that.
And that type of information is penetrating our daily life in almost every industry and every sector that somebody's working within now. I mean, you see that in social media popping up, for better or for worse at times, I suppose, but also just within, governments and everywhere. As you said, I mean, that it is such an integral part now of how we live and the way the world operates that you're right. I mean, you probably would have opportunities pretty much anywhere on this planet.
Yeah, no, that's an exciting way to think about it. And like I say, I'm very happy where I work, and I find the work that I do rewarding. But as a father of children, I see them on things like Snapchat and stuff like that, and it's built in. All that stuff is all that spatial data and all that spatial information. The mobile devices we carry, it's all applied in fundamentally the same way. But there's so many different ways that you can use that data. You can see where your friends are, what movie theater they went to, or you can send a group of workers out to investigate a situation or survey pests, invasive species. It's all basically the same thing. So working with this technology is really it's really cool, and I feel sometimes like it's it's cutting edge, although it's been around for a long time.
No, it's really interesting. There's a few more questions I want to get into, but we'll hopefully cover that later on the talk. On that note, maybe we could jump into our next segment here, which is a Q&A discovery. I've got a few questions for you here. And the first one here is, something I'd read recently, which surprised me a little bit, was basically that most technologies are actually improving quite slowly. And of course, this would seem to run counter to what most people's opinions are about tech. But basically, MIT researchers have found that 80% of technologies improve at less than 25% per year. Now, this is where it gets interesting. When it comes to information technology, that sector is said to be a completely different animal. It's long been connected to exponential rates of change. Now, of course, with GIS being in the latter category, I'm curious about what kind of change you've witnessed in your career thus far. I mean, does that myth of exponential change hold true, in your opinion?
That's hard to quantify. But yeah, I've definitely witnessed change that I would consider to be large. I know I don't consider myself old yet. I'm in my 40s, but for the latter half, longer than the latter half of my year, I've either been in education or working in this field. And when I started in this field, compared to what I'm doing now, it's night and day. And so let's say that's a period of 20 to 22 years. So yeah, like I can say when I started in GIS, we were carrying out complex models, modeling, spatial analysis, but we were all doing that on a command prompt on these big clunky workstations. I can remember buying my first thumb drive, and it was 64 megabytes, and it was cutting edge, and it was expensive, but I needed it for school because the school was phasing out floppy disks. So, but now that's just laughable. We started, like I said, DOS-based prompting to carry out processes and analysis, and you had to know all those commands and command line. Things evolved. By the time I went to do some post-secondary education, we were already working in a Windows environment, which was, it's changed. It was a lot easier, but at the same time, it had its own idiosyncrasies, and it was still pretty clunky. Like back then, if you were doing GIS, I felt like, not to say that it's not a specialization, but it was pretty specific. You had to know exactly what you were talking about. You had to have a lot of knowledge about geography. I can remember studying map projections and having tests in school on countless different map projections and how to apply them and doing different kinds of analysis at different places based on what kind of maps or applications you were creating. Nowadays, it's a lot more straightforward. I have kids that are just about in high school and they're seeing things on their computers now. It's more coming of age. It's more user friendly. You may not necessarily need to know all of that science or geography or principles or definitely command prompts in behind, but you can do stuff. You know what I mean? You can do stuff on your phone. You can go to Google Maps and you can save a hiking route, and then you can apply it to something else and share it with your friends. And you don't have to know about datums or transformations and that kind of stuff. So, but now, yes. So even nowadays in my job, we're creating applications by dragging and dropping data sets into software and pushing them out to mobile devices. So, 20 years ago, that was the future, and that's what we're doing now.
It sounds a lot of it could be linked to like just processing speeds and like just hardware being able to handle, just like you said, such large sets of data and like computing it that quickly and being able to package it up perhaps. And
no, I think it's definitely tied to the evolution of technology, because it is, it's a software based technology. But at the same time, I feel like the field is proliferating. When I started in GIS, I can remember when I got my first job, my parents said, I don't know what that is. I don't understand what that is. Now I can go shopping and, I have a T-shirt that says something about GIS on it. And I've been approached and asked by younger people in school about, where I work and what I do, because they've learned about that. So it's definitely something that's more known nowadays. It's easier to talk about. So combined with the advent in technology, I think so many more people out there doing it are pushing change. That being said, it's already a massive industry. We have large software companies like ESRI, or Environmental Systems Research Institute. If you don't know about GIS, you might not have heard of them, but I call them, they're like the Microsoft of GIS. They've been around since the 60s, developing GIS software, pushing change, and evolving software all the time. But so is it evolving? Yes. Is it exponential? That's anybody's guess, but it definitely is. And it's exciting for the future.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it. All right, I'd like to jump into the second question here, Dave. I mean, are there any aspects to the job that have kind of caught you off guard as far as applications go? For example, have you had any unique client requests for a certain kind of data that just surprised you in some way?
Yeah, I'll honestly say that I'm surprised frequently. And that's part of what I love about my employer, because as we touched on earlier, the specific place that I work is a very broad mandate. So, like I said, I was unaware of a lot of it previous to my employment. So I have doctors and scientists that are constantly presenting findings or asking for help or working in conjunction with to create maps and models to illustrate their data to help them with their project. So that's interesting because I get to learn about different things all the time. An epidemiologist or a veterinarian or a food specialist or an inspector or even somebody in management who just wants to track
their kids.
Or yeah. Hey, don't get me wrong. Kids or where the best place to get a sandwich for lunch is. But no. So yeah, I love my job because it's fresh, and I feel like the work that I do actually my piece of these larger projects and this larger mandate adds to betterment of life for the public in the country that I live in, and safety for the general public. It's very rewarding work.
Well, I kind of like flipping sides here with that, sentiment in mind. I'd be curious about any of the pressures that kind of go along with, this role. Is this the kind of job that can sit with you long after the day ends? Or are you able to decompress? And
I'm very lucky in the fact that my employer is very modernly minded when it comes to things like mental health and family. But yeah, it can. Not all the time. You know what? There's now I am going to date myself. I can say there's the days where the horn rings and I, like Fred Flintstone, run down the back and I'm off to work and I don't think about it the next day. But when I'm working on something like an emergency that's important, yeah, it's pressure because you see the real impacts on people in the world, negative impacts and potential negative impacts.
What would be Sorry to interrupt you, Dave. What would be an example of an emergency? I mean, you don't have to go into great detail, but I mean, just to kind of give a little bit of a clearer picture.
Yeah, if there was a disease outbreak, for example, I would be called upon, not just me, but there's a large team of people that work to respond in tracking and, finding places that are vulnerable. And that's where I come into play, right? So yeah, we have groups of people out there, and we don't have, the traditional public servant job in that time. We work until things are settled and taken care of. You can be called away from your family. You can, which happens. You can be called away from your family for long periods of time. You work in a high stress environment and you're actually seeing these things happen and the effects of your decisions and your help. So, no one's an island in any of that. I'm part of a large team. And there's other people that do what I do as well. But yeah, that can definitely stick with you. And, but at the same time, it's rewarding. So it's a great job, because tomorrow I might just think I'm going to work on one of those repetitive tasks, but all it takes is, a ping on your phone and something like that comes up. So
I guess, like, looking at things on the other side of the coin, have you had special moments where, like, one particular project that really stood out for you that delivered a high degree of satisfaction, like something that you still kind of like, can look back on now and feel proud of?
Yeah, I do, actually. Going along with what we were just talking about, in my tenure where I work, I've had the opportunity to work on a few responses like we just mentioned. And a lot of the time they end up, becoming large in the public eye. And I can, spend a period of time away from my family. I'm a husband. I'm a father of two sons. And after being away for a period of time, I can relax with my family. And I've seen what I've been working on the news, and I've had my kids say, "Hey, Dad, is that the thing that you were working on? That's really cool. That really affects a lot of people. Like, wow." And like, kind of feel like pretty proud of yourself. Kind of feel like a superhero. Yeah, you can ramp it up a bit too. So they're really,
of course. Oh, excellent. No, I think we're definitely painting a picture here for people that I think is getting clearer by the minute. So no, this is really, really interesting stuff. Maybe we can segue into another segment here, something I call a water cooler story. And basically here, I just have guests, indulge the listeners with a personal story relating to the job. So I'll let you take it from here. If there's anything that stood out to you that you'd like to share.
A personal story from GIS over the last 20 years. Well, this one's gonna fall under the category of geek, I guess. So in the field of GIS, as I think I mentioned already, there's one large company that kind of overshadows and is almost synonymous with GIS. The company is called Esri, which is an acronym, ESRI. That company has been around since the 60s, I'm sorry. They're based in Southern California, in Redlands, California. And in the past, I've actually interviewed for them, and I've gone to California, and I'm going back 14 or 15 years, and I was actually offered a job there. For family reasons, I decided not to pursue employment with ESRI. But ESRI every single year hosts a humongous, what they call the Esri User Conference, and it's in San Diego. And you can go to this conference, and it's a week. You go to San Diego, which is great to begin with. That would be enough for most people. But it's a whole week of GIS. There's lightning talks and exhibits and expos and all sorts of networking opportunities and educational opportunities. And actually, I've had the chance to go to this conference twice. And the last time I was there at a social event, I met Jack Dangermond. Don't ask him if you have him on your show, because he wouldn't remember, but I remember. Jack Dangermond is the CEO of Esri, and he's the founder of Esri, and he's been what most people call the father of GIS. He was pretty much one of the pioneers in this field who started this field back in the 60s. And he runs this wildly successful company. If any of the listeners want to research it, I recommend they look up Esri. And it was just a social kind of, I'm going to say like a wine and cheese kind of thing. And I recognized this elderly gentleman walking with I assume is his wife, and I went up to him and said, "Hey, are you Jack?" And he was very, like, a lot of people were talking to him. A lot of GIS geeks were there. Of course, it's like a Comic Con for GIS people. But anyway, he gave me a couple minutes, took a selfie with me, and asked me. He genuinely asked me. He's like, "Where do you work? How do you use this technology?" And he was interested. And I called my wife after, and she was like, "Wow, great." But I'm like, it would be like meeting Bill Gates or something.
I hear you. He's like the Michael Jordan of GIS, basically, right?
Yeah, he's the Michael Jordan of GIS, exactly. I don't have a poster on my wall or anything, but it was pretty cool. So that's one of the highlights I say I have when I think about GIS.
No, interesting. Okay. Well, thanks for sharing that. We're going to move into another segment here, and this is called the Crystal Ball segment. And basically, we're shifting more towards the future. Usually, I ask guests to share information about trends, predictions, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm going to lead off with this right now. In terms of GIS as a whole, where do you see this field going? I mean, it would seem that the combination of mapping plus surveillance is a bit of a controversial intersection. Of course, we also want, need, and rely on a lot of GIS applications. However, people are also kind of awakening to issues of privacy and technology. I'd be curious to hear, somebody in your position take on this matter.
Well, that's a real concern, and it is something that I deal with. Privacy is a big issue because GIS isn't just software. GIS is the software platform, whichever one you choose to use, and the data. Now, the data has to come from somewhere, right? You don't always own the data. So yeah, privacy is a big issue. But where the field is going in regards to that is, I think it's only going to become more accessible. Just what we talked about earlier with the evolution of technology and the mindset about our location, and devices and everybody being able to use this kind of technology. I think it's just going to become more accessible. So like when I started in this field, there were only a few software providers, Esri being the main one, but there are other ones. The software was very specialized. You had to have the education. You could open the software and see a million things and not understand what it was even for. Not to mention it was really expensive, like wildly expensive. You weren't doing GIS back then unless you were at a school that had an agreement for licenses or an employer that purchased the software. But nowadays there's a plethora of software providers. You can purchase the software. You can purchase Home Edition. You might be a GIS specialist or a GIS analyst working at it at the office on a really expensive license tier. But for $100 a year, you can have it at home to further your education or work on it. Or you get subscriptions. There's even open source GIS out there nowadays. So anybody who wants to learn about it, they can go online, download open source GIS, or use web mapping applications. As for data, like I said, privacy is always an issue. But again, there's so much out there available. Whatever flavor, like what do you want to? Are you in school studying environmental science or soil science or, hydrography? Are you, in business, or, do you want to do, logistical tracking and route planning? You can do all that from home. You can get these data sets.
Sorry to interrupt you there. I'd be curious if privacy and again, just the awareness of it being like an impediment to some of this progress within GIS. Like now that even just myself, like watching, just different documentaries here and there. I recall watching one last year and it was on social media as a whole. And they had a lot of the tech executives from Facebook and Instagram and, all of them basically. And they're outlining all their different strategies and techniques and showing this. And it's become a bit of a point where the public is getting a little bit more aware of some of these issues and how their data is being actually used. That I'm curious whether or not, like, again, being a public servant, whether or not, where you work, those issues are popping up a little bit more and it's becoming a little bit more of a hot button issue that you guys have to be a little bit more aware of in terms of how you're communicating and being more transparent, perhaps? I don't know how it's being handled, but that's kind of what.
No, the types of data that I work with and that we work with, when that is very important, because there are sensitivity issues. It may seem like I'm being vague about a lot of the things I'm talking to for that exact reason. However, at the same time, there are a lot of so basically every data set we work with, or every data set we create, or every data set we work with in agreement on another department, there are sensitivity issues and they're categorized. So there are things that are publicly available because they're non-sensitive, but not even sensitivity, because there seems to be sometimes this black box about what's going on. It's privacy issues. You can't share that sort of stuff. So again, in the sorts of, like, I don't work at a place like Snapchat or Facebook.
No.
But that sort of information is very seriously taken into consideration. Publicly collected information, like when you download an app and you do stuff like that, that's a completely different ball of wax, which I kind of feel a little bit out of my element to talk about. But yeah, privacy has always been, since day one, ownership of data, right, has always been an aspect. And actually, some of the technology that exists nowadays, it's built in. So Esri has a great product that anybody's free to use called ArcGIS Online, AGOL. And when you log in, of course, you have to register. It's free. You can instantly, once you're logged in and registered, access an online GIS platform. But there's a catalog of thousands of free data sets. And anybody who has ArcGIS online, whether they be a kid at home or an executive or a scientist, are free to upload information there for you to use. Once you do that, you agree to the fact that that's now public, in the public domain, right? So, but then you can do what's called value-added mapping to that, right? So you, Chris Schoenwald, could mess around with this and say, hey, this is really cool. This is runoff in the area that I live. I saw something else online, and you can add it to and make your own map from that information. That's how the data is evolving. But of course, privacy all comes into that, right? So public domain versus private domain is definitely a big.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area. I mean, again, kind of alluding back to the conversation on how tech is evolving, and especially tech relating to information. And it would seem that, like, the faster that tech is coming out, it is, like you said, a bit of a black box of what is being used. How is it? If you want to use this app, do you agree to this? And it's like a 5-page text, and everyone's always just scroll down to the bottom. Agree. But really, I mean, like, what are you agreeing to? Nobody really reads that, right? But it is that black box of how is it being used in behind the scenes. It's interesting. It's fascinating. What makes it interesting to me, I think, is the fact that, again, like I alluded to this in the introduction of you, is like just how deeply tied in we are to all this technology. Like what you're doing is so critical to, keeping our societies running smoothly, whether it be plant-borne diseases or invasive species and so on and so forth. So it's just, it's interesting how all of these things are kind of developing all at the same time. And it's always creating new sets of rules, essentially. And we're always trying to play catch up on the impacts of using this type of data are going to be. And it's just fascinating to me anyway. But
well, it's definitely an interesting time. And if you have time for it, I have a small funny anecdote that can illustrate that. Me working in GIS and spatial data science, I like to think I'm really up on technology. But I have a father who doesn't know how to use a GPS and would much rather write everything down and have a map. And so I just find helping him is that static shot of a change in time and how we do things and how we use spatial information. Because a paper map is spatial information, but someone of our generation might not incline to use that. So I look at my kids, my youngest of whom is 10, and say, geez, what's he going to do in the future? Like, how is this going to evolve? But like I said, the data and the data privacy, it gets muddled over time because it's just so accessible.
Yeah, I think it's just going to be something that we're going to have to learn to live with, in a sense, and continually
think so.
Adapting to it. All right. Well, fascinating talk there. Anyway, I think we are drawing to a close here, but I have to say, Dave, I mean, it's been a lot of fun. You shared like a lot of really interesting information. I think that, again, it's just going to make it a lot easier for people to comprehend and just get plugged in terms of what your role is in professionals like you and what you do and how essential it is for us to continue to have like a smooth running culture in society. So big thanks to you for coming on the show today.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Great. Well, for those interested in learning more about Dave and his work, you can find and connect with him through LinkedIn. And this information will be included in the show notes. Also, if you like today's show, be sure to tell a friend and share. Also, to show support, you can rate, review, and subscribe wherever you access your podcasts. And don't forget to join us for the next episode of Life as a, where we'll continue to explore and unearth the details of professions and the people behind them. I'm Christopher Schoenwald, your host, and until next time, stay curious about life and living.